Hello and welcome to the first Halloween special from Spookghetti Kozak Media. Spookghetti, like spooky? See, I was doing it, never mind. So in this video we're going to be talking about Lovecraft, and that being the case, it's time for the obligatory disclaimer. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, apart from being a prolific writer with a massive cultural impact, was also a racist, xenophobic dickhead, even by the standards of his own time. There is some speculation that he came to regret this much later in life, but he died relatively young, so his reputation as a bigot stuck, which is one reason why it's important not to be a racist dickbag. And while it's perfectly acceptable to separate authors from their work, Lovecraft's prejudices definitely and noticeably influenced his work, so it's good to be aware of that. Remember that being critical of an author's failings and pointing out the problematic aspects of their work doesn't mean people are advocating for censorship or canceling their work. Criticizing problematic things in art isn't the equivalent of calling for them to be censored. Lovecraft isn't canceled. Nobody's canceling him or his work. His writings are widely available for purchase in bookstores, and we now have a critically acclaimed TV series from a black writer-producer with a mostly black cast, not only inspired by, but literally named after Lovecraft. We can have discussions about these things like critically thinking adults and not whine about non-existent cancel culture. Seriously, stop whining about cancel culture. That's not a real thing. Shut the fuck. Now that we've got that out of the way, the theme of this video will be games inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. I can't claim to be a lifelong horror fan, but if there's one author whose work I found fascinating for its influence if not its intrinsic qualities, it would have to be H.P. Here's a guy who spends most of his career as a pulp writer, never publishes anything longer than a novella, and arguably has an overly verbose writing style that gets pretty grating at times. And despite all that, he manages to practically invent the genre of cosmic horror and develops a rich universe of monsters and aliens that becomes so pervasive that audiences often encounter references to it without ever realizing it. In the Lovecraftian universe, humankind is insignificant, which, in a certain sense, is very much like our real universe. But unlike, or hopefully unlike real life, Lovecraft's universe is also populated by horrors beyond human comprehension, and to know about their existence and attempt to comprehend them is to embrace madness. These monsters aren't always necessarily evil or specifically hostile to humankind. They're often just simply indifferent to us, which, as it turns out, can be just as bad. Needless to say, Lovecraft stories typically don't have happy endings. Characters may escape an immediate threat, but are left with the knowledge of a fate that is both disastrous and inevitable. Lovecraft understood the key role of the unknown in horror. He didn't rely on standard classic monsters of his day like werewolves or mummies. His monsters are often chimeras, described as formless or shapeless, often composed of many mouths, eyes, legs, and perhaps that which is most often associated with his work and the mythos it spawned, tentacles. Tentacles! And speaking of tentacles, if there's one thing Lovecraft got 100% right about the real world, it's that the ocean is a terrifying, terrible place. I mean, look at the kind of shit they've got swimming around down there. And that's just what we know about. The ocean is nothing but a non-stop horror show. You should never go there. Don't listen to this little crab son of a bitch right here. This is a propagandist, okay? Stay the hell out of the ocean. Another unique point about Lovecraft's work is that often his creatures are not seen but merely hinted at or briefly glimpsed. H.P. didn't need to show you a monster or have someone getting killed by it to provoke disturbing feelings in the reader. He's able to incite dread just by setting up that these things exist and getting the reader to ponder the implications of that. One last interesting aspect of Lovecraft, one which I find interesting in a world where multinational corporations use their influence to extend copyrights and limit the public domain, was how he created what one of his friends and fellow writer August Derleth named the Cthulhu Mythos. This was essentially an early version of a unified fictional universe filled with different creatures, places, and objects, but unlike modern incarnations of these things, Lovecraft encouraged other writers to use and add to the mythos. What is more, it's all public domain, so if you want to use Lovecraftian entities in your own fictional works, have at it. Actually, on second thought, maybe don't have at it, or have less at it, something like that. Just go away. I chose to talk about Lovecraftian games mainly because I was introduced to the mythos and in turn his work through video games, though not necessarily the ones you might expect. To understand how this came to be, let me introduce you to a guy named Sandy Peterson. Sandy got his start in game design through tabletop role-playing games, and in 1981, he created Call of Cthulhu, named after one of Lovecraft's most famous works. And speaking of the original Call of Cthulhu, here's the February 1928 issue of Weird Tales in which it was published. Notice anything? Yeah, the cover story is Ghost Table. The editors decided that Ghost Table was apparently more deserving for the cover story in this issue. Oh no, it's the nefarious ghost table! Sorry for the digression, but I just think it's funny how pop culture tastes shift over time and how those things with lasting impact were sometimes overlooked in their era. Good thing to keep in mind. Anyway, back to Sandy. Sandy Peterson didn't just stick to tabletop games. And in the early 90s, he went to work for this little indie game developer. You've probably never heard of it. He helped them develop this obscure little game with a small cult following called Doom. Then he did this other game you probably missed. It was kind of a sleeper hit. It was called Quake. And then he went on to design another indie hit game, Hentai Sniper Middle East. Wait, what? No, what the hell is this, Steam? What are you doing? This is because I play Insurgency Sandstorm? How is this actually similar to forget it. Seriously though, Peterson not only designed a lot of levels in the original Doom, but he also named all the enemies. And it was thanks to Sandy's influence that I was exposed to the Lovecraft mythos through Doom and Quake. Now, as you're probably thinking, Doom and Quake aren't exactly very literary games. So it's a good time to point out that Lovecraftian influence in video games can vary greatly. Some games explicitly take inspiration from the mythos, sometimes incorporating specific creatures or entities in their plots. Others may include more subtle references or nods to the lore. Some games simply entail Lovecraftian cosmic horror themes rather than explicit references. As for the games I'm going to talk about, I'm limiting myself to games I've actually played. Moreover, I'm arranging them in a rough chronological order and rating them according to an almost entirely arbitrary system using the most appropriate symbol I can think of for this topic. Tentacles! First, let's start with Quake, id Software's initial foray into the fully 3D arena. Quake had a troubled production history and initially was supposed to be some kind of fantasy-themed game with RPG elements and a plot based around time travel. In fact, it was originally going to be called Time Quake. At some point they decided they need to get this thing out the door, so they rewrote a bunch of stuff and added in a touch of Lovecraft. Now interestingly, Quake actually contains 3 direct mythos references. You've got the huge bullet sponge line of sight attack shamblers. They'll be showing up in another game in this review as well. Then you've got a couple bosses named after famous mythos entities, as well as some level names inspired by Lovecraft stories, such as the Nameless City. Quake of course also centers around concepts like interdimensional travel and alternate realities. Each episode begins in a futuristic military installation, but then you travel through a gate to some gloomy, uninviting dimension filled with monsters. Now, despite all this, it's important to note that Quake's Lovecraft quality pretty much ends at names and the general atmosphere of some levels. Like its predecessor Doom, Quake lets you be a killing machine, blasting all those eldritch horrors right in their eldritch faces. This, incidentally, is very un-Lovecraftian. Lovecraftian monsters aren't always invincible, and they can certainly be killed by conventional means, but usually it doesn't matter because there's a lot more where that monster came from, or there's something much worse out there that won't be stopped so easily. Gunning down hordes of the eldritch with a nail gun just isn't very mythos at all. So while Quake is a great game in its own right, according to my totally arbitrary and inconsistent rating system for this video, I can only give it 3 tentacles. Now another game that takes Lovecraftian inspiration but in a very un-Lovecraft format is Dusk. Dusk is an indie horror FPS inspired by Quake. It's pretty simple but really addictive. It's nice to see an FPS that gives you the speed and mobility we used to have in the classic games. The graphics are simple, even more so than the original Quake, yet Dusk manages to create a genuinely creepy atmosphere at times. Oh, and wait till you start meeting these invisible bastards. Oh shit, die you son of a bitch! Every goddamn time, I swear. Does this deserve to be on the Lovecraft game list? Well, the story meets the criteria for starters. You've got this small town that gets quarantined by the government for some unknown reason. Your player is a treasure hunter who thinks it would be a great idea to see what he can find inside the Forbidden Zone. Big surprise, it's not. Turns out there are unsavory things in the depths below the town. And that's definitely a Lovecraftian theme. Also, there is one major direct reference to the Cthulhu Mythos, but I won't spoil that one for you. You'll just have to play the game and find it for yourself. But even if it's not a true HP horror game, Dusk is worth picking up if you like having your library stocked with some mindless action games for those times when you just want to turn off your brain and blast hordes of enemies with a shotgun. Or even 2 shotguns. Nice game. 3 tentacles. Alright, the next game I'm going to talk about very briefly because, to be honest, I personally wasn't too impressed by it. Despite that, it's so directly Lovecraft inspired and I did actually play it, so I can't really leave it out. The game is called Conarium, and it's basically like a sequel to Lovecraft's novella At the Mountains of Madness. In case you haven't read it, it's about an expedition to the South Pole that discovers a massive alien city in the center of Antarctica. The narrator learns that the city was built by an alien race referred to as the Elder Things, who came to Earth millions of years before humankind even evolved. Needless to say, things don't go too well for that expedition. Conarium takes place sometime later when a second expedition has been sent to Antarctica. You wake up from a bizarre vision and find yourself totally alone in the base, with only fragments of your memory. Despite the first-person perspective, Conarium is above all an adventure game, requiring you to find items and solve puzzles. That being said, I have to say that although it had a great atmosphere and really gives you a feeling like you're taking part in the story of At the Mountains of Madness, the game was simply too slow-moving and boring for me. I know adventure games tend to be obtuse at times, but usually they give you a few easier puzzles in the beginning to give you more of a feel for the game and an idea of what you should be looking for. Conarium just isn't that intuitive at first, and it takes a lot of searching to find what you need, even in the very beginning. Then again, if you play games mostly for story and atmosphere, and if you're an avid fan of adventure games, you might enjoy Conarium. It's one of those games that gets pretty cheap anytime there's a sale, so just keep your eyes peeled. I'm going to give it 2 tentacles. Now we're going to get into an officially licensed Call of Cthulhu game. One which probably got me the most interested in the Cthulhu Mythos lore. The game is 2006's Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth. I have a lot of great things to say about this game, but I have to be upfront about something. This game is buggy. How buggy, you ask? Well, let me put it this way. I first picked this up in 2009 and was playing the shit out of it during the long January holidays in Moscow. Then I ended up encountering a game-breaking bug that I wasn't able to adequately fix, so I had to give it up about 3/4 of the way through. Now, nearly a decade later, I noticed the game is still on Steam for about $5, so I figured maybe they patched it by now, right? Nope. Ran into the same game-breaking bug. A while later, I got kind of fed up and decided to pull out all the stops to get the game to work. I finally managed to find a fix and successfully applied it to actually complete the game, literally about a month ago. Yes, that's right. I have waited over 10 years to properly complete this game. And you know what? It was worth it. For all its bugs, Dark Corners of the Earth combines a great, thoroughly Lovecraftian style storyline with perfect atmosphere and gameplay that truly makes you feel vulnerable. Just to give you an idea of how close to the lore this game is, it's largely inspired by Lovecraft's story Shadow over Innsmouth, and one of the most tense set pieces has you essentially recreating the protagonist's escape from a group of locals trying to murder him in his hotel room. But unlike in the story, you play as Jack Walters, Private Eye, investigating a case of a missing person in Innsmouth. Jack's no ordinary detective, however. He has a seemingly supernatural perception that helps him solve cases. In the game, this is typically depicted in short cutscenes where Jack is able to see through the eyes of other people and things. 6 years earlier, he had a run-in with a cult and an encounter that left him in a mental hospital for some time before he was discharged to wander around for the remainder of the time with no sense of himself or what happened while he was out. His first case since reawakening is to find a missing shop manager in Innsmouth, an out-of-the-way New England fishing town with a strange infection among the locals and a serious lack of hospitality. Things start to go downhill fairly quick as Jack begins his investigation.
It's a recent family photo. The corner's been torn off. I can only see Thomas and Ramona Waits in the picture.
The best way to describe this game is a hybrid of survival horror FPS with heavy realism. You have no heads-up display and you must aim down your sights. That is when you're fortunate enough to have firearms and ammunition. Wounds affect specific body parts and have detrimental effects on your movement, aiming, and vision. You have a med kit with limited supplies which you use to heal wounds, but doing so takes time, so you can only heal when it's safe. Like old-school survival horror games, you have to collect items and solve puzzles, and you examine your environment and objects with the use key. Letters, journals, and other texts help you solve puzzles with clues or combinations to safes. Ammo is limited and aiming is difficult, so your best option is usually stealth and evasion. In fact, in the first part of the game, those are your only options. Sure, being so vulnerable and defenseless can be unnerving at times, but then again, that's kind of the point. The first real threatening encounter you'll have in the game is that scene I mentioned earlier, where you have to escape the hotel in Innsmouth. And for the first few minutes, you're rushing through doors, bolting them behind you, and barricading others by pushing bookcases in front of them. Then you're jumping across fire escapes and narrowly evading your pursuers as they try to corner you. The whole time you're totally defenseless if they catch you, and when it all begins, you have very little margin for error. In fact, if you pull off the initial escape exactly as you're supposed to, you'll still just barely avoid getting whacked with an axe. Now speaking of walkthroughs, it's essential to keep one handy because, as you might expect, the game's puzzles get a little obtuse at times. The weird thing about this game is that sometimes it can get a little frustrating, but when you start to get the hang of it, it's really satisfying. This is especially true when a puzzle's got you stumped and then you finally notice something you overlooked that holds the key to solving it. But if that's not enough incentive for you, you'll definitely get a lot of satisfaction once you finally acquire some firearms so you can start going to town on these fish-faced freaks. Another thing I really liked about the Mythos in this game is that early on you're meeting the ones that are more human-like, so their voices sound a little bit off, but still relatively normal.
I'd not rightly know that for sure. All habits cleaning rooms at present.
But as the town turns against you and they're trying to kill you, you start running into Mythos who are further along in their transformation into deep ones, and their voices change accordingly. I thought this was a nice little detail and it really shows the dedication of the game's writers, even if the devs were lacking in some other departments, which brings us to the flaws. Okay, first of all, one of the game's primary offenses is that a lot of cutscenes are not skippable. And that kind of thing is always a problem in any game where you can die really frequently. And rest assured, you will die really frequently in this game. But I do recommend you watch the cutscenes, at least the first time around, because they often tell you what you're going to need to do in the next section, or they give you a warning about an approaching enemy. But of course, the other major flaw is the bugs. Lots of bugs. The stealth system isn't great, so as a general rule, stay low, in the dark, and out of lines of sight.
What was that?
There's a stealth kill system with the knife, but it's totally unreliable and you don't even really have the knife except in 2 sections of the game, so that doesn't really matter. The game is also weird when it comes to inflicting damage, so as a general rule of thumb, try to engage them at close range. Luckily for you, they usually aren't great shots themselves, so it's not really a problem. Now let's chat about the game-breaking bugs. The first one is really simple and easy to fix. There's a part where you have to open the safe in the police station before escaping the town. You have to push a bookcase out of the way to access it. But when you start pushing, for some reason the game crashes to desktop. No worries though, all you have to do is press shift to enter stealth mode, and then push the bookcase and it will work normally. The second bug is the one that basically kept me from finishing this game for years. On a later level called A Dangerous Voyage, you're on this ship that's heading towards Devil's Reef. At one point the ship starts encountering massive waves and you'll get injured or killed unless you hold on to these railings on the deck. What was supposed to happen in this part is that between the waves you'd run up to the deck gun and look through its scope at the reef in front of you. There you were supposed to see 3 blue lights that represented sorcerers who are responsible for the waves. You'd take them out with the cannon and the waves would stop and you'd move on to the next segment of the mission. The problem is that some bug makes those blue lights not appear, and as it turns out you can't just fire blindly at them, they're basically not even there. I put a link in the video description that explains how to fix this. Basically, if you've got the Steam version, you follow the instructions to download a different executable to run the game. Then you download this little app that patches said executable. I don't recommend playing around with the other options too much, and you should back up your executable before doing anything. But what worked for me was checking this option that basically skips that small part by automatically killing the sorcerers after a few waves. You don't really miss anything, and later on you're still going to get a chance to use that cannon. And when you do, it's going to be much more intense. Trust me. I honestly don't know why I've always given this game a pass despite all its flaws, but I just do. It has competent acting, a genuinely threatening horror atmosphere, puzzles that really make you think, and if nothing else, it is definitely challenging. Most of all, I think it's just a good story that keeps you coming back in spite of all the problems, because you want to see how everything turns out. It's really the kind of game that deserves a remake, not a remaster, but a full-on remake. And at the end of the day, it regularly sells for just $5, hard to balk at that price. I'm going to give it 5 tentacles. Next, we have a more recent official Call of Cthulhu licensed game. This one was released in 2018 and is simply called Call of Cthulhu. Now, because of the official license, it's hard not to make comparisons between this game and the older 2006 game. You're immediately going to note some plot similarities, but you have to understand that grizzled private detectives with dark, mysterious pasts are just a typical feature of Call of Cthulhu games. If you play the tabletop RPG, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of your character. But I think when making video games, the private eye protagonist just works better. Whereas the 2006 game is a sort of hybrid adventure, survival horror FPS, the 2018 Call of Cthulhu is really more of an adventure game with RPG elements. There are some stealth evasion sections, but what passes for combat is both brief and barely worthy of the term, which I have to say is unfortunate. I would say that one of the best ways to describe it is a sort of interactive movie, one whose plot can be altered in a variety of ways, leading to 4 different endings. In this game, you play as Edward Pierce, a combat veteran of the First World War, who is tormented by nightmares to the point that he needs sleeping pills just to get through the night. Pierce is a bit down on his luck and in danger of losing his private detective license if he can't make another case. After waking from another nightmare one morning, he's visited by a wealthy businessman whose daughter allegedly died in a fire along with her husband and their young son. Police blame the daughter, Sarah Hawkins, for the fire, claiming that she was insane. The father disagrees with their conclusion and wants Pierce to clear his daughter's name. As it turns out, Sarah Hawkins was a talented painter whose dark themes provoked both praise and controversy when she was alive. Her husband was the scion of a wealthy shipbuilder on the island of Darkwater, a once prosperous whaling settlement in the early 19th century. Pierce goes to Darkwater and begins to uncover not only the truth about what happened to the Hawkins family, but the island's own dark history as well. And the more he learns and comes to understand, the more his sanity begins to slip. Sanity is a major point in Call of Cthulhu, but not quite the same way it was in Dark Corners of the Earth. In this game, sanity has less effect on gameplay and is used instead to determine what outcomes you can achieve at the end of the game. Certain specific experiences will trigger sanity loss, and at times you're given an opportunity to make decisions which will also affect your sanity. When something like this happens, you'll see a little message saying that this action will affect your destiny. I don't want to spoil too much, but a general rule of thumb is you can preserve sanity by drinking alcohol. Warning, alcohol does not actually help you preserve your sanity. And the more your character learns about the occult and Cthulhu Mythos, the worse it will be for his sanity. So you could say that ignorance is bliss, but I think you really have to give this credit because the idea that having too much knowledge about these things would drive you insane is of course one of the core themes in almost all of Lovecraft's major works. The game basically lets you upgrade your character attributes, which in turn determines how successful you'll be at accomplishing various tasks or getting information out of NPCs. Unfortunately, it's kind of difficult to fully appreciate how much of any attribute you need to pull off any specific task. But it does make a difference in some parts, and what is more, the game does offer you multiple ways to accomplish some objectives. Unlike Dark Corners of the Earth, however, this Call of Cthulhu definitely feels more linear. There are little icons telling you what you can examine, as opposed to letting you explore at will until your character notices something. That being said, the first time I played through this, I figured it wouldn't have any replay value, yet I found myself playing through it at least 4 times, so I guess I was wrong there. I feel the lack of combat is a real flaw. Dark Corners of the Earth actually handled it fairly well at times, so there's no reason why they couldn't implement something comparable in this game. The game's story is well developed, and the more you explore and investigate, the more you'll learn about the island and its characters. And speaking of the characters, the game really shines here. Your protagonist might be something of a cliche, but he's intelligent and sincere. I kinda prefer the voice of Jack Walters from Dark Corners of the Earth, but that's just me. The other characters are mostly well voiced, and the dialogue is made more interesting by the fact that your actions and skills can unlock different questions and answers. However, sometimes the model's hand gestures when they're speaking can be a little out of whack, but it's a minor problem. It's mildly amusing, if anything. I realize this version of Call of Cthulhu may not appeal to just anyone, so I'd recommend it mainly to people who are already fans of the mythos, or perhaps fans of the Call of Cthulhu RPG. Or if you're someone who is interested in either of those and seriously wants to dive deeper into the genre, this would be a decent start. If anything, you could just wait till it's on sale. All in all, I'll give this game 3 tentacles for gameplay, but let's say 20 tentacles for being true to the genre. Alright, we've got one more game to review, and this one really impressed the hell out of me. It's called The Sinking City by Frogwares. Now, why am I mentioning the developer in this? Well, dear viewer, as it turns out, Frogwares is Ukrainian. And that isn't just some incidental fact. You can see the Ukrainian influence in the game. How much Ukrainian influence is there? Well, you can unlock different outfits for your character, and one of them is a Vyshyvanka.
I'm talking rap.
Seriously though, another reason I'm highlighting the developer is because they've been in a battle with a publisher that tried to rip them off, and for that reason they've been forced to pull the game down from Steam and the Epic Games Store. Now you have to go to frogwares.com in order to purchase it, but trust me, it is well worth it. I got it back in 2019 when it was still on Epic Games, and paid full price for it plus the DLC. Again, totally worth it. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The Sinking City is an open-world detective game, and it was one of the most unique experiences I've had in any kind of open-world game. You play as Charles Reed, who is, you guessed it, a private detective. This time, he's a U.S. Navy veteran who was shipwrecked on a mysterious island, and afterward developed a sort of sixth sense. Sound familiar? He's also plagued by nightmares. Again, familiar? But here's where the similarities end. Reed is plagued by nightmarish visions, and in the course of trying to figure out what they mean, he is drawn to a small New England town called Oakmont. Oakmont is so small and remote that it doesn't appear on many of the maps of the area, but that's the least of the town's problems because it's experiencing biblical flooding, and that has also brought an infestation of monsters called wild beasts. As Reed seeks out help for his condition, He gets caught up in a web of intrigue between local gangsters, secret societies, and of course, cults. Sinking City combines a lot of different genres. For starters, it really is a detective game. You'll collect evidence, piece together crime scenes, and on occasion, moving the case forward requires you to do research in the archives of the local newspaper, the hospital, town hall, or police station. And on that note, let me say right now, hands down, the best thing about this game, it does not hold your hand at all. Most open world games have been getting easier for years now, to the point where they'll literally superimpose a trail of arrows down the road to get you to your destination. Sinking City does virtually none of this. You set markers manually and follow them using your compass. Locations you need to visit are usually given using cross streets, which you'll have to look up on the map. It takes a little getting used to at times, but you'll learn to appreciate the way the game encourages you to think for yourself. Plus, there is fast travel, so you don't spend too much time in transit. You just have to uncover these payphones that serve as fast travel locations first. You get around town on foot, but since many areas are flooded, you will sometimes need to use these motorboats. One thing you definitely don't want to do is fall into the water for any significant length of time. There are man-eating eels down there. See, that's classic Lovecraft right there. Stay the hell out of the damn sea. He tried to warn you. Now, another thing you'll have to look for when you're running about town is infested areas. These are typically blocked off by barricades, meaning monsters usually won't be able to follow you out if you have to run away. And trust me, you'll have to do a lot of running away in this game. Why is that? Well, much like in a survival horror game, ammunition is scarce. You acquire weapons very gradually throughout the game, and your ammo capacity for each of them is capped fairly low. You get ammunition by crafting it from junk you find around town. It can't be bought since bullets are actually used as currency since the whole town's turned to barter. And here's another catch. The only way to find significant amounts of supplies is to explore infested areas. You need ammo to battle the monsters there, but you've got to risk running into them to get the ammo. It's a really good system. Remember, in a proper Lovecraftian game, you shouldn't be mowing down hordes of monsters with a well-stocked arsenal. Most of the time you should be running, and that is definitely the case in this game. You want to try to stock up on ammo before going into potentially dangerous areas, and when you do, you always want to have an escape plan ready. The enemies in the game typically spawn out of the ground when you get near, or if you trigger them by some action, so you have to be on your toes at all times. I have to say I like the enemies as well. They reminded me a little bit of Stranger Things and Silent Hill, and I'm glad they went with some original designs rather than the standard Cthulhu Mythos fare. That being said, you will encounter some things directly from the Mythos, and there are plenty of references. But what I like about Sinking City is that it's its own story, expanding on the mythos in an original way while staying true to the themes. Like the official Call of Cthulhu games, Sinking City has a sanity mechanic in addition to your normal health bar. If you use too much of your sixth sense or have some close encounters with enemies, you'll start experiencing visual hallucinations and tunnel vision. Sanity loss can be treated with antipsychotics, but like your health, you need a few seconds to apply them. Examining locations for evidence entails a lot of different actions. You examine items in the environment. Sometimes you must use your sixth sense to dispel illusions that hide items or passageways. Sometimes you must use the sense on an item to see a scene showing what happened with it earlier. Other times, activating your sixth sense will reveal ghostly apparitions that will lead you to clues. Usually at some point you'll have to enter a reconstruction scene a little similar to those you see in Call of Cthulhu. Only in Sinking City, after you find all the elements of the scene, you must then try to put everything in order to determine what actually happened. Doing so will help you gain experience to develop your character, just like completing other missions. Probably the best feature of Sinking City is the city itself. It's foreboding, gloomy, and a sense of dread permeates everything. There are docks, residential neighborhoods, an insane asylum, a cemetery, a mysterious church, a downtown district, even an old amusement park. Due to the size of the city, the developers created it via procedural generation. Now this does mean some interiors are a bit bland and repetitive, but it's not a fatal flaw. If anything, it contributes to a feeling of déjà vu, which really fits in with the theme of madness so critical in games of this genre. Even without the DLC, there's a lot to do in this game, both in your main case and the many side cases you uncover along the way. You're often given options about how you want to solve certain cases, and while these will change the story as you go, they don't really affect the ending. Speaking of which, there are 3 different endings in this game, but unlike Call of Cthulhu, they are all available to you once you reach the end, and it's really just a matter of what you prefer to do. I have to say that's a little less interesting than Call of Cthulhu's system, where the endings you could choose from were determined by your sanity and decisions you made during the game. But whereas Call of Cthulhu is more like an interactive movie where you're working your way to the end, Sinking City is more about the gameplay and the journey itself. I can't say enough good things about Sinking City. It's just such a unique experience. It doesn't hold your hand or let you get too powerful. It forces you to think whether you're trying to figure out a case or just plan a trip through an infested area to scavenge for supplies. And it does all this within a truly creepy atmosphere that is true to the Lovecraftian genre while incorporating plenty of original ideas and expanding on some of HP's classic stories. If I had to pick one of the most standout experiences in the game, it's anytime you're exploring some building and you suddenly hear the roar that announces the presence of one of the larger monsters. That's when you start rapidly trying to figure out if you've got enough weapons or ammo, or, failing that, trying to determine how you're going to escape, assuming that monster is not blocking your only way out. This really is a game that has a little bit of everything. A complex plot and side stories, compelling, unique, and sometimes disturbing characters, and it has a carefully balanced system that forces you to plan out every potentially dangerous encounter ahead of time. I'm going to give this game, let's see, all the tentacles! And besides, Frogwares could use your support, so consider heading over to their website and buying it. With any luck, we'll get more in this genre from them. So that's it for the Spooky Halloween special. If you want to talk about some other Lovecraft-inspired games, by all means, leave a comment. And if you try Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth and you get stuck somewhere, feel free to tell me what problems you're having, because I've played through the whole thing now, and I realize the handful of walkthroughs out there aren't always that helpful. As always, I ask you to click like and subscribe, and check out the description for the link to my Patreon page where you can support my work. And of course, thank you to my existing patrons, and I hope your pandemic Halloween is as fun as it can be given the circumstances. See you next time.